There we go. Right, so I just wanted to welcome everyone to GlasgowTea. This is one of our kind of early sessions, so I think this might be our 4th or 5th session now. To anybody that hasn't joined us before, we're part of the Reproducibility Network, and we're a Glasgow-based journal club for early career researchers, and we basically are just trying to share and learn through each other's experiences of open science. Today we're obviously joined by Dr. Emma Norris, which is absolutely amazing. We're so excited to have you here. And she's going to be discussing applying the behaviour change wheel to increase uptake of open science. So yeah, as I just briefly mentioned, this session is going to be recorded, so if you could just keep yourselves on mute throughout the talking section, that would be fantastic. And then once Emma's finished, I'll stop the recording and we can have a bit of chat and discussion about what we've heard. If you want to post in the chat throughout, if you've got any questions, then that's great, just post them in the chat and we can pick those up at the end. Or just wait and you can ask her yourself at the end. But I'll pass over to you now. I don't know if you want to just do like a brief introduction and kind of introduce yourself, but I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation. I was involved in setting up UCL's reproducibility in 2019. And that was in the days where we could all sit around a table and have nice conversations. So it's really nice to be invited to a fellow network in Glasgow today. So I'm a lecturer in public health and I work in behaviour change and health psychology. And I'm also chair of Brunel's Open Research Working Group as part of the UK Reproducibility Network. And I've just started getting that going in the last few months. So today I'm going to kind of just go on a bit of a ramble really of my reflections on where we are in terms of open science and interventions to increase open science, and some ideas of what we could do to maybe enhance how rigorously these interventions are developed and evaluated based on behaviour change theory and experience really. So yeah, I'll be thinking about how we can use behaviour change as quite a complex and diverse field to increase open science initiatives and develop them, really to benefit all researchers across career stages, and how we can tailor and design interventions to suit their needs. And using the behaviour change wheel approach. And so there's many different approaches to behaviour change, and this is just one of many. And I'll explain why I'm kind of using this approach to work this through. And also in the context of pre-registration of research, with some study that I did with a master's student at UCL, Chris Osborne, last year and into this year. And then I'll end by thinking about how open behaviour change research itself is, with a case study of work that I did in regards to smoking cessation behaviour change research. So that's kind of where we'll go today. Just a note to say as well, for various unknown Zoom related reasons, I've had to close all of my tabs and windows. So I have no idea if anyone's asking me a question or anything like that. So I'll leave it to the team to monitor that. But please do interrupt me if there's any kind of burning questions you have, and we'll follow up the rest at the end. So we all know now that there are many different and really successful initiatives to drive open science globally within the UK. And these are just a snapshot of my favourites, and they might be your favourites too. So obviously we have kind of the wider infrastructures like Open Science Framework and incentive-based strategies such as the Open Science Badges that we see in many journals now. And then we also kind of have a lot more of the, I'd say more grassroots interventions as well, where people have kind of seen a need for something to be changed and have taken it upon themselves to go ahead and do that. So we have examples like ReproducibiliTea, obviously we're all here today, driven by people, often early career researchers that want to open up this discussion. Everything Hurts, which is my personal favourite open science podcast, although others are available. And UK Reproducibility Network, which I believe Glasgow's a part of, Brunel's a part of. I think 30 odd institutions in the UK are part of now, and really driving up institutional change in their own organisation to improve open science. So we know that these are going on and that these are doing really great work, but there's always room for improvement. And we'll all know people that aren't really aware of open science and don't really know where to start. And so there's lots of kind of perceived barriers around open science still that we could seek to address and to improve. And so my kind of thoughts as a health behaviour change researcher were, are there any strategies and techniques that we can use from behaviour change to increase uptake of open science? And so a couple of years ago now, myself and Professor Darryl O'Connor from Leeds University kind of were talking through these ideas at a real world conference in Croatia, which was lovely, in the before times. And we kind of wrote a discussion paper about the kind of positive things that behaviour change can bring to increasing uptake in open science. So behaviour change is quite a multidisciplinary domain. It comes from psychology, sociology, economics, and many other different fields as well. Although as a psychologist myself, I kind of see psychology as a really key component of behaviour change research, especially my area of health behaviour change. And alongside that, we all know that kind of psychology is really spearheading the open science movement. We're seeing a lot of progress in terms of improvements in psychology across the board. So, you know, there seems to be a little bit of a mismatch here in that there's a really ripe field of behaviour change that to some extent hasn't really been utilised much to increase uptake in open science from what I can see at the moment. So, you know, we want to consider to what extent behaviour change is behind the process and the initiatives that are being developed, and how can existing behaviour change theory that has had lots of success in health, economics, environmental behaviours, for example, how can that be used to inform the interventions that we might further develop? So in that paper, we looked at just one model of behaviour change, and there are many, many more to choose from. But we looked at the behaviour change wheel, which is a really fantastic kind of one-size-fits-all approach to changing behaviour, regardless of what the behaviour is. It's designed to be kind of all-inclusive and kind of simplistic and easy-to-use model of behaviour change that's been derived from many different frameworks of behaviour change in different disciplines. And it basically gives you 4 steps for how you can design and evaluate an intervention to change behaviour. And it's used really widely in the UK and internationally across research, government and policy. And it's led by Professor Susan Mickey, who's at UCL's Centre for Behaviour Change, where I did my postdoc before my current role. So in this talk, I'll kind of talk through those 4 steps of the development process and how we can potentially use the behaviour change wheel to design interventions that are more based in evidence and are based in the barriers that people perceive to adopting open science. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what the wheel is itself, but just to give an overview of the kind of 4 main steps that are involved, and to thank the Centre for Behaviour Change and Daniel de Lima for letting me use this slide, because I think it captures it really nicely. So firstly, you want to think about what behaviour you're trying to change, and that's kind of really thinking about specifying that and narrowing that down. So who is involved, what do they need to do, when and where. So for open science, perhaps you might want to focus on pre-registration as an end goal behaviour, but we need to think about who we want to pre-register. What do they need to do to get to that end goal of pre-registration? When in the research process they need to do it, and where in the research process and where in their kind of own environment do they need to do that process of pre-registration. And we'll kind of follow through the rest of the steps as we go along this talk. But starting from here, so what behaviour might we be trying to change for an open science intervention? So you'll probably have seen these before. There's many other ways of categorising open science. These are just a snapshot, and there's obviously also the taxonomy of open science from Foster. But so there's kind of many different facets to open science is the point I'm trying to get here. So they're also quite diverse. So obviously things like citizen science and co-production are included within open science as well, which are really important to widen open science beyond the ivory towers as such. But then also we have got the more kind of data-driven and data-focused approaches, like open data behaviours, open material behaviours, as well as making the end products of our research open in terms of open access and so on, and preprints. So there's many, many different behaviours that are involved in open science, and probably argue that not one intervention is going to be able to address all these things. So often in behaviour change, we're really thinking about really defining one or maybe two behaviours in a lot of detail and focusing on those to really tailor an intervention that's best fitted to improve those behaviours. So any one of these behaviours, just picking one of these models, can be actually broken down into a lot more sub-behaviours as such. So if we think about open data, for example, the end product is having your data freely available for reshare with, you know, all those restrictions lifted as such. But there's a whole number of steps that are involved and behaviours that are involved in getting to that endpoint. So, you know, you need to be able to understand how you can record your data in a way that's understandable to you and to other people. You probably need some training to get up to speed and how to make your data open and what repositories might be available. There's such a wide range of repositories. So obviously there's Open Science Framework. Brunel has its own Figshare, which is its own repository. You might want to make your data open via the journal publication itself. There's a whole range of ways that you can do it. So you might need some support to be able to do that in the most appropriate way. If you're using Open Science Framework, you need an account. You need to know how to construct a page for your project and so on. So when we really break these things down, they're more complicated than they may seem at first. And so we want to make sure that any initiative that we develop or intervention allows kind of the full breadth of these behaviours to be covered so that we can more confidently address the end goal, which is making your data open. And in thinking, you know, around who we want to do any of these behaviours, obviously we all work as part of a wider science ecosystem. We're not just independent researchers working in an isolated way. So, you know, the decisions that we make in terms of whether we can adopt open science behaviours will change project to project, but also will change depending on what institution we're working in at a given time, what the values of that university or institution might be, who your supervisor is, for example, what research group you work in, the department you work in, etc. This whole ecosystem that we work in has a big effect on whether we feel able to adopt these open science behaviours and whether we feel supported to as well. And obviously beyond university institutions, we have the wider structure of kind of publishers, funders, etc., that allow us to apply for funding to do this work and publish it. So it really is across the board that we're not just working as independent researchers. We need to recognise these really broad range of influences on our own behaviour. And when we do each of these behaviours really depends on what it is. So open data is obviously towards the end of a project, whereas pre-registration would be towards the beginning. So the purpose of this kind of who, what, where, when questions is really to help us flesh out what particularly we want to focus on in the development of an intervention and what the barriers and facilitators might be to identify and explore them as part of intervention development. And these questions are kind of relevant to any behaviour change intervention, not just open science, but we really need to think about whatever behaviour we choose to focus on, we need to think about the impact of that behaviour intervention. So if you address one behaviour, is there a knock-on effect in a negative way perhaps on another one? So I don't know, let's think. So if you design an intervention to target open data and really focus on towards the end process of a given project, does that mean that people are less likely to do any of the other parts of open science that might be more beneficial at the beginning of a project due to time restrictions, for example? Or they just feel overwhelmed to try and adopt multiple behaviours at once. And thinking about, you know, what's the likelihood that that behaviour might be implemented, and what's the cost in terms of time, especially is a really big barrier for open science, as we know. Registered reports, for example, you need to have quite a lot of, well, you may need a bit more extra time to get that registered report approval at the early stage of a project, which is kind of a big barrier, especially for PhD researchers and people that are kind of working in short scale projects that need to be completed in a kind of short time scale. And that spillover effect is what I was talking about earlier in terms of, so if we kind of address one behaviour, what are the knock-on effects of other behaviours that might be also related to open science. So when we've kind of specified what behaviour exactly we want to focus on, we can then get to the really interesting part, which is really speaking to people and finding out what the barriers and enablers are for them in relation to the behaviour that we're trying to change. And this is where the kind of centre of the behaviour change wheel comes into play, which is the COM-B model. COM-B standing for capability, opportunity and motivation, which are shown by the behaviour change wheel to kind of be the three main, very broad and general constructs that ultimately influence whether or not we partake in a behaviour. And these constructs also influence each other. So to go into a bit more detail, so capability is in terms of our psychological capability. So whether we psychologically feel able to do a given behaviour, do we have the skills involved that allow us to do that? And our physical capability, so can we physically almost move our body to do that given behaviour? So in open science, we can see that psychological capability will be particularly important, because if people don't have the skills and kind of perceived capabilities of doing it, then they're less likely to be able to do, make their data open or pre-register their studies. Moving on to motivation, so there's kind of reflective motivation, so it's more in terms of our intentions to do a behaviour, and our automatic motivation, which is kind of our habits and our routines. So we think of open science, you're not going to have an automatic motivation to pre-register, for example, if you haven't done it before. So that's something that builds up over time. The more projects that we pre-register, the more increase we'll see in our kind of automatic motivation to automatically, at the start of a project, think about pre-registering. And then finally, we've got opportunity, which is split into physical opportunity. So that's in terms of having the physical resources to be able to do this. So, for example, having access to an open data repository, or access to funding in some instances to publish in open access journals, or preprints. And also the social environment, which I think is really, really important. So social opportunity in terms of your peers around you, your colleagues and your supervisors and managers further up the chain at the university or wherever you're working. So in a nutshell, all of these can be seen as important for any behaviour, and we'll be exploring these in terms of open science and specifically pre-registration. So I ran a study led by a master's student that I worked with at UCL, Chris Osborne, and we're still kind of working on this data for publication now, but the pre-registration is there if you want to check it out. But Chris ran an online questionnaire last year, which is based on that COM-B model, and we promoted it on social media. So if you did that questionnaire, thank you very much. We look forward to finishing the analysis and publishing it soon. So that had kind of structured questions, but also really valuable were free text questions. And they were based around the capability, opportunity and motivation aspects, and how they influence pre-registration. So yeah, you can see the details of the demographics in brief there. Mostly early career researchers, which we're kind of expecting, but also pleased to see quite good engagement from people later in their career as well. Help us get an idea of the kind of spread of pre-registration experience and perceptions across the scale. One thing to note is that most people had already pre-registered before. So obviously there is a kind of self-selection bias in the sample, which we'll note in the paper as well. I think partially the promotion of this on social media might be contributing to this, in that, at least in my social media, most people that follow me and I follow tend to be advocates for open science anyway, which would be kind of associated with them more likely to have pre-registered. Anyway, let's go on to some. So I'm going to just give you an idea of what the questionnaire items were related to each of these aspects. So in terms of psychological capability, items included things like I'm confident I know what pre-registration is. For reflective motivation, I believe pre-registration could improve research transparency, and a reversed item there as well. And in terms of opportunity, so having the time to pre-register and feeling incentivized by your university or employers to pre-register. And social opportunity, an example item is, I'm influenced by someone senior to me who encourages pre-registration. So there were around 44 items in total, but these are just some examples to put the combi into context in terms of pre-reg. So I'm going to, I think, focus more on the quotes rather than the questionnaire data, just for the purposes of this talk, because I think the quotes to me were of real interest, and I think really especially capture the experience of early career researchers, which I think is kind of, you know, beneficial for reproducibility in particular. So I will read one or two of these, but you can read them for yourself as well. So in terms of psychological capability, an early career researcher commented that, in my experience, there are always, and that's, those asterisks are already in the quote, there are always unexpected things that happen, and so far none of my pre-registrations have accounted for every possibility. So this is the idea that it's a kind of developing process as well. The more you do pre-registrations, I think the better that they become, but there are always kind of, you know, analytic inflexibility that might still occur and can be a problem when you're doing pre-registration in particular. In terms of physical opportunity, I'll pick just as the top quote there from a mid-career researcher. I do not think my university cares if I pre-register my studies or not, so long as I meet my key performance indicators. I think this is something that's shared across a lot of people working in academia and working towards promotion criteria, for example. This is something that I'm working with at Brunel as well, to try and increase the adoption of recognition for open science in promotion criteria, which we're kind of hoping to approve in the next year or so. That there isn't currently, you know, universal recognition for this. So if you're not really rewarded for doing pre-registration of open science, then the kind of reward is more, you know, internal reward rather than external reward. And I think with pre-registration, this is quite a big issue. So yeah, and conversely, an early career researcher at the bottom here said that their department has an open science policy that strongly encourages and requires pre-registration. And I think this experience is still in the minority, and will obviously vary depending on what department that you're in. Most people that completed this were more from a psychology background, but myself working in public health department now, there is really limited to no awareness of open science at all. So we're starting from the kind of baseline, and trying to add things like pre-registration is quite a good behaviour, I think, to add, because in terms of clinical trials and other sorts of trials, there's already an expectation that you pre-register in a clinical trials repository, for example. So pre-registration for public health and related fields might be a good gateway behaviour into open science, because it's kind of familiar to some extent already. Right, so in terms of social opportunity, a mid-career researcher, I know some senior scholars who have absolutely taught me how to do the best science, and I look up to these people. So an example of kind of a role model effect that I feel like many of us would like to see more of as well. But also being influenced by other early career researchers. And I think, you know, things like reproducibility really show this off, that it's kind of, you know, looking to inspiration from people of a similar career level to you. And I know I definitely have had that experience as well, and that's what drew me into open science and pre-registration, for example. And finally, in terms of reflective motivation, I independently chose to pursue pre-registration, and personally know of very few others who do so. So I think to some extent in some fields, pre-registration still is quite a novel thing, but we're seeing movements to increase that, as we'll see later on. And I think overall it's a good thing for the research and for me. So I think that's really important, that it's not just for your own individual gain, that it's for the benefit of your own field that you work in, as well as wider research and science as well, which I think is important to remember. So that's just kind of an example of how we've done what's called like a behavioural diagnosis in behaviour change wheel terminology, of what's really important and what the barriers and enablers are according to that COMBI model. And when we've kind of done that diagnosis, we can think about what broad intervention approaches might be most relevant to address those issues. And in the behaviour change wheel, so obviously the combi is the green wheel in the middle, and the wheel around that is what are called intervention functions. So these are kind of the broad approaches to interventions that we can use. And the wheel gives you basically a grid that I'll show you in a moment, recommending, so if you find physical capabilities is a big factor, for example, it will recommend which of these intervention functions are most suitable to address that. So just to think briefly about what these functions mean in relation to open science. So in terms of, what are educational interventions for open science? So we know there are really great free resources and training, such as the Open Science MOOC and many other resources. And this picture here is from the reproducibility workshop that was held in Cumberland Lodge in Windsor in 2019. in the old days, I'm in there somewhere, as might be people here today as well. And that was kind of, a residential course, really get to grips with what the principles of open science were and get some really great role model supervision during that time as well. And then we have what I'm kind of calling kind of persuasion elements, and I've put reproducibility here, and by persuasion I kind of mean in terms of opening up that conversation and trying to think about ways that we can convert ourselves and other people to be more open in our research. But also social media for me is a big thing as well, opening up that conversation again, and podcasts and other communication strategies to really open up that discussion. Incentivization, so obviously badges that I talked about earlier, and I think promotion and recruitment criteria is a really important part here. And I think many people working in different institutions running open research working groups are kind of really working to push that recognition. Coercion, which is not one that I am a fan of, but in terms of, it's almost the shaming element of people that are found to have done research fraud, for example, or to some limited extent, kind of shaming people that aren't doing open science type research at the moment, which I think is not necessarily helpful. We should be focusing on some of these more positive aspects of intervention development. Training, and by that we mean the kind of more, sit down and learn the skills rather than just being told the information of what open science is. Enablement, so things such as infrastructures like Open Science Framework enable us to be more open and to make our data and other things available. Modelling, so we may all have our favourite advocates for open science in our own fields, so we can imagine some pictures here of who they may be. But I think that most of us have role models that we look up to, and we think that kind of they've done really fantastic progress in terms of open science. And also the way that we restructure the environment that we work in as researchers, so things again like OSF, and things like SIPS conference, which is coming up. So these kind of events and infrastructures to open up these conversations and share understanding and progress in open science is really important. And finally, restrictions. So here I've put this kind of money analogy in terms of open science funding is still quite limited. So research to develop interventions is limited, and research to assess the extent that researchers are working openly is quite limited. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of for this area here. So there's lots to do basically, and so for any particular aspect of open science you want to be maybe focusing on a couple of these based on the behavioural diagnosis that you did before, using the COM-B model, speaking to people and finding out what barriers there are. So the behaviour change will provide you with a table basically, so to say if you have one particular issue or a couple, what functions might you want to include. So the study that I mentioned earlier with Chris on pre-registration, we found that psychological capability, physical opportunity and social opportunity were the real main issues. So obviously if you follow this across in the table, you'll find there's quite a lot of things that you could address. So I'm just going to illustrate some here just for the purposes of this talk. So in terms of improving people's psychological capability, so the skills that they have and the confidence they have, we could use education by providing information and support on the steps required to pre-register. So not just informing them what the end product of pre-registration is, but really providing a tailored step-by-step approach for them and for their given type of study. In terms of more training, so that relates here to psychological capability and physical opportunity, we might be thinking about providing a workshop on how to pre-register a study, where people can actually come with a study that they have in mind that they want to pre-register and get some actual one-to-one support to actually do that in practice. And finally, just another example is enablement, which is seen to kind of be relevant to all of these. So that might be ensuring that there's an infrastructure in place to pre-register, making sure that's available for the given study design. So having a template that exists that is applicable to someone's given research study, and making that applicable for whatever research domain that someone's interested in. So Open Science Framework is great for this because it's kind of open to all areas of science, but I think the pre-registration template element is still comes up as an issue for some people. They don't feel that there's a template that quite suits them yet. So they're the kind of broad approaches that you could use to embed within an intervention. And so we'll think just briefly now about the kind of more fine-grained components that you might want to include in an intervention, and specifically thinking about behaviour change techniques. And I'll explain what they are. So within the behaviour change wheel, there's what's called the behaviour change techniques taxonomy, which is basically a range of 93 different techniques that you can embed within interventions. They're named as active ingredients as such. Using kind of a medical term, because it's kind of the active components that we think will actually result in change in a behavioural intervention. So there's an app for this taxonomy if you are interested in that, and there's also a paper as well that basically outlines the taxonomy. So the taxonomic structure basically has groups and subgroups. So for each BCT, there's a definition for what that BCT is, some examples of what it is, and some notes on how you can identify and embed them. So just picking some of these behaviour change techniques to kind of illustrate how they might be applied for open science. So credible source is a BCT, which basically is the idea that you have someone that's respectable to kind of model the behaviour. So, you know, we've kind of seen that before, that there are particular figureheads in a particular domain that could be used to kind of drive and the direction of travel in a domain in regards to open science. But I think also it's really important from an early career perspective that we can see people of a similar level to us that have dealt with their own barriers in relation to making their data open, for example, or pre-registering, and learn from their own experiences. So I definitely think that in terms of credible source, it's not just the more senior members of staff, it's also learning from other people that we can relate to and do similar research to us. And action planning is another BCT that might be applicable here. So that's the idea of really planning like how, when and where you're going to do something. So whether that's how, when and where you're going to go to the gym or go for a run on a given day. Here we're thinking about it in terms of how you might add a new open science behaviour into your project. And I think that's the message that many people are kind of positing around open science, is that you don't need to do all of these different things. You need to think about which open science behaviours are applicable to your own research and try and incrementally try these out. So maybe think about, for a new project, what one aspect of open science are you going to focus on? So are you just going to try out a pre-registration in this project? Or are you going to try more at the latter end of the project to try a preprint, for example? So really kind of taking the time to plan how you're going to adopt an open science behaviour for a new project or for a range of projects, say for a PhD, for example. And just one more illustrative BCT, so graded tasks. So this is the idea that you kind of incrementally add the difficulty of a task or to reach a behaviour that you're interested in, to help build your confidence and your competence in that. So one example I thought of for this is, so pre-registration is kind of a gateway into more potentially difficult souped up version of pre-reg, which is registered reports, which has kind of more complexities in terms of timelines that you need to consider and the detail that you need to go into. So yeah, there's 93 BCTs, so there's lots of potential ideas to choose from, but the point being that they allow you to kind of be more specific about the individual bits of content that you want to include in an intervention. Okay, so that's a summary of the behaviour change wheel and how it could be applied to open science. I wanted to end briefly on an example of a project that I worked on around how open behaviour change research itself actually is. So this is kind of more of a meta science project with colleagues from UCL. And we looked at smoking cessation behaviour change research. We looked at 100 randomised controlled trials that were published between 2018 and 2019 to see what aspects of open science they included. And we found that the majority of papers were published in open access journals, and the majority were also pre-registered. I think I mentioned earlier, but around kind of health and clinical trial research, it's already very common to have to publish your pre-registration of what you'll do on a clinical trials registry. We can critique the detail that's required in these different registries and how sufficient that is, but majority of them were pre-registered. However, a lot less of these RCTs and smoking cessation had open materials. And by that we mean the kind of intervention content that was delivered primarily, so questionnaires that might have been used or actual content that was delivered within the packages of intervention, and less around open data at 7%, 1%, so one study gave examples of their full code to be reproduced, and none of them were replication studies. I do think that's interesting because in smoking cessation and any health intervention, if you've got an intervention that you know works, I think it's really important that we can try to replicate that in other contexts. So one issue in health research is that much of it is based in Western populations, so we should be able to take a package that works and replicate it in other countries as well, for example. Okay, so just ending on some ideas of how we can progress from where we are now. So I think using behaviour change models like the behaviour change wheel is really useful to help us identify what the barriers and facilitators are to different open science behaviours. So the pre-registration study I talked about is one example. It's the kind of, I believe, the first study that's used behaviour change wheel to assess open science. But we can look at this across different career stages, across different fields and different countries to see what's really going on in a given context. And we can use that information to develop interventions to increase open science that are really tailored to the barriers that exist there. And we can also really think about how we evaluate these interventions as well. So yes, we're interested in short-term behaviour change, longer-term behaviour change. So are people continuing to make their data open, for example, in subsequent years of research? And also I think attitudes are still really important in terms of open science. Behaviour change does tend to focus on the end goal of behaviour, but attitudes and social constructs are also really important to help us influence the ultimate behaviour. So that's it from me. Thanks in particular to Darryl O'Connor and Chris Osborne, who worked on the papers that I've spoken about today. And yeah, I welcome any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was fantastic.
Have a sip.